Sure. Do I need to call this to order since
No,
this
we're
is-
just going to recognize that this is a joint work session of the P&Z and the Town Council. And at our work session, we have P&Z members Dylan Johns and Tracy Bennett, and from the council, we have Auden Schindler, Katie Schwer, and Mayor Jackie Whitsitt. And we're here for this work session on the CSC zone district. So we kind of reorganized and scheduled this as really kind of an opportunity to bring the council up to speed on the work that we were doing on the zoning. So a little bit what we're gonna do today is I'm just gonna set a little bit of a historical framework. And then Don is going to kind of outline what's in the CSC zone district, and Dylan is going to explain why the P&Z did what they did. So really, there's only a couple things I wanted to say, and that is that the P&Z's to this date has been operating under the direction of the town council in terms of our town planning process. And this started right after the November 2013 election. It was like the next meeting where the town council decided that we would start this planning process, and they started passing resolutions as early as January 2014, kind of setting the overall framework. So a year ago in February, the town council directed a lot of different activities and assigned a lot of different tasks for who was going to do tasks in our town planning effort. And the philosophy at that time was let the committees kind of do a lot of the heavy lifting here in staff. So, for example, the Parks, Open Space, and Trails Committee was kind of assigned to work on the park. And the P&Z had really two tasks. They had the task of preparing the master plan amendment to reflect really a committee that was called the Downtown Area Advisory Committee, and they had done a report. So their job was to take that report and do a master plan amendment to reflect that, and then also to do the zoning. So they basically had two tasks. The master plan, I mean, I think most of you guys know, it sets, here's our general parameters, here's our policies for development in our town planning effort. The zoning piece is where you set out more specific rules and regulations about what you want a particular development project to come in and do. So the master plan amendment was adopted by the P&Z last fall in October, and then the town council adopted it in November. And I know Katie knows this, and I thought I told Auden, but the difference in the town of Basalt versus most communities in Colorado is that both the P&Z and the town council adopt the master plan. And then our charter also says that all development applications have to be reviewed for conformance with the master plan. The master plan's adopted. Now what we're doing is we're working on the particular zoning. And just generally, originally, the CDC, the Roaring Fork Community Development Corporation, originally came in and they created this community serving commercial zone district. And they were intending to apply that. The town adopted that zone district. They were intending to apply it to the mobile home park. And it was a little bit different because it was really at that time a nonprofit campus type of idea. So, a year ago in February, the P&Z, without the help of Don, did some work on the zoning district and then kind of set it aside to work on the master plan amendment. And then when we were getting the master plan amendment really kind of set, we hired Don Elliott to really help guide the P&Z through, really to get more expert advice on kind of what legal frameworks were possible, and really kind of try to lead the P&Z through that. So Don, we kind of started out looking at a variety of different techniques, including the CSC zone district, and the P&Z ended up deciding that the community serving zone district, that kind of idea and the framework really was the best choice, but it needed a lot of work. So since that time, we've been working with Dawn to flesh out the details of how that works. And the other thing I would just say is that one of the kind of underlying principles of what we ended up doing was we decided that we're creating a district that we can that developers can use in our town parcels, but that we weren't gonna go, our current thinking is we're not gonna go and rezone the property to CSC zone district. It's a zone district that we wanna give enough definition that developers will wanna use it because it gives them, one, a lot of direction in terms of what the town wants to see, and two, that it has an easier process. So it has that two-step process rather than that heavily laborious three-step PUD process. So,
Why wouldn't you rezone? Sorry for not raising my hand.
I just had a question.
we don't, it was a work session, so we don't have to be so quite so
If they
formal.
don't pick, though, if they
Uh-huh.
don't pick CSC, you're saying they can select to use it. If they don't select it, what do they get?
Well, they have their current zoning, which,
Current zoning.
they have the current zoning, and they could say, okay, I want C2, I wanna do C3 PUD and do a PUD process. So they could pick a different zone district, and, take it through a more laborious process.
Oh, I see, that, you're pushing them toward that because it's easier.
Yeah, it's easier. We're easier, and also we're telling someone, it isn't a free-for-all. We're really giving a lot of definition of really the type of development that we are expecting to see. So with that, I'm gonna turn it over to Dawn to kind of walk through the framework.
Okay, great.
And Dylan can interrupt at any time. Our kind of thought was that Don would talk and then you, Dylan, would explain more, but I think you could feel free to this, because this is a lot more informal than we initially kind of thought.
Well, that's a good summary of how we got here. Again, I'm Don Elliott, I'm with Clarion Associates, and this is the type of work we do around the country. We're based in Denver, but I write zoning codes for a living, to the amazement of my kids, who think it's a terribly boring way to spend your life.
Amazement's not the right word, but.
Disgust, maybe. Dismay, maybe dismay is what I'm looking for. But I do it because it really does help shape the future, and if you get it right. So, just to continue on the train and then do your little outline of the sections. This is an interesting thing because the Our Town planning process looks at these parcels, these 4 parcels, as a whole. Together, they make up what you want to have happening down here. That's a little bit unusual. If you just if you just zoned each parcel individually, it would be hard to make them work together. And frankly, you want some flexibility between what can happen on the different parcels as long as they collectively create what you want to have down here. So yes, you want to send a signal to the market that implements the Our Town planning plan. You don't want to make each one of them be negotiated individually. You don't want them to run the risk, really, that they're just going to go each one their own way under their own zoning if you can create an incentive to do something else. And the last thing I'll say is this. You don't want to shrink wrap it too tightly. My experience all over the country is the longer you think about something, the more you can refine it to be a perfect picture of what you want. But that perfect picture seldom happens because property owners change, the markets change, conditions change, investors change. And I urge people carefully to say, listen, aim these things so that if those things changed, it would still work for you. Even if a new property owner came in, they would not have to say, well, let's start over. That was his vision, that was her vision, that was based on their personal preferences. So the trick has been, how do you make them work together, allow enough flexibility so that collectively they got some wiggle room, and don't try to shrink wrap it around a picture. And that's a very hard temptation to resist, but the more you do it, the more I find in my experience, you're writing something that will not get used because nobody will come to your party. So with that background, can we go to the one outline here? And I'll just go to the next slide. I'm just going to walk through quickly one thing here. I want to give you the structure. I'm not going to read this to you. There's lots of interesting things, but I think the best use of our time is probably to have me orient you to what's in there, and then if you want me to explain in more detail the different parts, or Dylan to explain, Tracy, anybody, that'd be great. I'm just giving you the framework, and then I'll sit down and we'll see what you want to talk about in terms of going forward. There's an intent and applicability section, which includes the map that you saw before. It is designed so that the 4 parcels together achieve our town planning goals without forcing any one of them to do just one thing. It's trying to say there could be some flexibility as to who achieves what. Threshold requirements, the community serving idea came out of the original CSC zoning, that it's not required to be a nonprofit or a do-good organization, but the point was that these are prime parcels in the middle of town, and that idea came from the earlier CSC draft that was developed for the CDC property, and it's been broadened and made a little more flexible. There's a section that talks about permitted use, and this is important. There's a table in there that says there are certain things the town really wants to happen in these districts. Now, some sites are better suited to some uses, and some sites are better suited to others, but the text says these are the anchor uses that are available on each one of these 4 parcels. We want you to do this if you happen to be the owner of that parcel. If you do, you don't have to ask for permission to change it. But it does say that the town council can decide that an anchor use proposed for one, if you could come in and say, I can't do that one, but I can do this one on the parcel next door. Or I could do it on a parcel, I could do a different one that is still an anchor use, that still tries to get the planning process implemented. So anchor uses, there's a table, but there's some flexibility. Community vitality uses comes out of an idea that you've used in other parts of the code, basically trying to encourage real active public frontage uses. So that's been brought over from another part of the code. And then there is a section that says, you know, assuming you have achieved, you're doing one of the anchor uses, there's a long list of things, other things you could do on the property. But the structure is, you can't come in and say, I don't want to do any of your anchor uses, I want to do a secondary use. If that happens, you can't stop somebody from asking, but under this ordinance, if they said, I want your CSC, but I can't do any of these, I can do a little of this, but this is what I'm going to do, planning and zoning should say, we recommend denial. And you could do, as elected officials, what you want, but the idea is that that's not good enough. You need to be doing one of the anchor uses, even if it's not exactly the anchor use that is listed for your property on that table. Let's go on down. Dimensional requirements are basically heights, setbacks, and the amount of open space required in different areas. I will say, without stealing the thunder of any of the questions, heights has received a lot of discussion, trying to make sure that it is not too high for basalt, that is not overshadowing things that are near it, trying to make sure that things taper down to sensitive edges. I'm not going to go into more time in that. There's a table that gets into this, and a lot of discussion went around heights. Other site development standards are just what I would say quality. And by the way, this A, B, C, D, E, F structure roughly parallels the way your other chapters are written. It's meant to fit in with the way the code reads now, so that it's not a kind of a fish out of water. It's not a completely new thing. So, talking about keeping visual openings to the river from various points, pedestrian through connections through the parcels at various points. Obviously, the vitality zone goes with the vitality uses, but it ties into parking, signage, lighting. It goes beyond that, but this is the quality stuff that is beyond the dimensional, which will be 5 sections. And then review. As Susan mentioned, the idea is to try to offer opportunities that get the plan adopted, that give some flexibility among the parcels, and then to offer an easier review process that avoids some of the time and adds some more predictability to what the town is willing to achieve. And I think with that just basic framework, once again, if you want to talk more about any of these things, I'd be happy to do it, but I wanted to keep it short on the intro, and then we can take it from there. What did I miss?
Well, I think that maybe we could jump a little bit, because maybe Bill was talking about kind of some of the basic kind of principles behind where we got the 2.5 stories and where we wanted 2.5 stories, where we wanted 4 stories. Unless you'd like me to do that, Dylan.
No, I'll jump in here. So we, as a planning and zoning commission, actually started doing some planning exercises before our town planning process officially was even thought of. And so I'd say that our board in general has been pretty passionate about at least trying to look at the town and get an understanding of where it is, where does it want to go, and so it was great when the town embraced that and actually made it into a more formal citizen process, and there was so much participation. It was really awesome to see all the ideas that came out of that, and then Tracy was on the DAC commission along with was it Chris who was on that? And so we kind of, as Susan said, sort of took a little bit of a holiday from talking about all that, let those guys do what they were doing, and then come back to us with a report, which we kind of one of these places. I think a lot of times in urban planning and community planning, you have these areas which aren't necessarily successful because they just have something that nobody really wants to go to, and so you kind of have this part of town that's a little bit more dead than you'd otherwise want, and so that's where the concept of this anchor use came into play, which was and the chart then is at least an approximation of what we thought when we looked at downtown. What was it missing? What could be added to it that would help to enhance the vitality that people like to talk about? And so that concept came in, and then as far as trying to establish what some of the dimensional aspects of this are, which usually wind up being the things that people react strongest to because they have a perception of what a big building is and what a tall building is, or those sorts of mental imagery. And one of the challenges with being able to do that in a very specific format was that with at least two of these parcels, the big ones, the city doesn't own, we really didn't know how much land we're talking about with that. And so the usual process of establishing a zoning code says that you take a percentage multiplier by the size of the lot that you're working with, and you say based on that you can have this much floor area. So for us to try to get too detailed in that seemed like it was going to be very difficult to actually try to capture, and at the end of the day, without doing a lot of modeling and specific studies related to each one of these parcels and scenarios, we really didn't know if we were going to overstuff the envelope that we wanted to have, or whether or not it was going to just be empty and it was going to fail on its own merits. I think it was great that the town, put together the model, which I think helped to really kind of give some sense of how the application of floor area, at least on the CDC parcel and Lyons and Marino, would look like. But at the same time, we were looking at those models as kind of a general, well, where are we? What are we in line with what we're trying to do? Are we going to allow for whatever happens here to be successful, but not really get into debating whether 5,000 square feet one way or another was good or bad. And the same went for height. We approached it from the standpoint of most of town is 2 stories on Main Street. And I think it became pretty apparent that a lot of people on the board included, didn't want to create something that was in stark contrast to what town already was. And with Willits being down the road, as an example, there was one presentation where a concept was illustrated for the BCC parcel that looked very much like Willits, and I think there was a unanimous, that's not what we want here, response to that. So what we then came up with was, let's look at doing what's been called 2.5 stories, two stories along the street with a setback 3rd story when that is appropriate, when that fits in. to try to get at least the option to add some more program to the buildings that are here, because in a sense, we're asking these parcels to do a lot. And the more that the CDC parcel, the more that gets removed from a developable envelope there, the more pressure that might put on the BCC parcel to increase its density. And I heard numerous people over the course of our meetings talk about how, well, we can just put that over on the BCC parcel. Well, maybe not, is what we started to understand. And when you're writing a zoning code, as Don said, you can't necessarily make it do exactly what you want it to do, but you try to design in mechanisms that are going to keep it from being what you don't want it to be, and sort of leave it up to the development team that comes in with whatever idea they have to sort of try to fit things in there and make it work. So our sort of process for getting to what our height limits are was to say, all right, for 2 stories, we want to have some high ceilings on the ground floor, because in just about every mountain town, the Victorian age, when they were building buildings in a sort of urban environment, you had taller ceilings in that ground floor, and then you had a certain amount above that, which wasn't extreme, but it was definitely a lot less. And so we tried to say, all right, what's a sort of reasonable amount of height that each floor would need to have to, have its space, have its structure, have its mechanical systems and all those things that go in there. And let's just sort of establish it at that. And the process of measuring height, again, like floor area, is one of those things where, depending on what the land is doing before you get there, you might have a height which is higher than what that sort of general, our goal is to have 2 or 3 stories. It might change because of the way the topography works. So we tried to stay away from that, at least at this point, and sort of wait for the more specific application to come in, and then people could then assess, how they felt about it. But the big thing was making sure that when you're along the 2 Rivers Road, when you're along the river on the Frying Pan, when you are adjacent to the park area on the CDC parcel, that those buildings do have a sensitivity towards that pedestrian existing framework of town fabric. There's some language in there that talks about trying to maintain a building pattern that sort of mimics what the buildings in downtown commonly are. It's 20 to 30 feet module. Yeah. So there's this module that's been sort of built into the code language to try to give some basics there. And then one thing that I've run into a lot in my practice, and being having served on many years of planning and zonings, is that something like open space requirements tend to, if you don't focus them, they tend to just wind up somewhere, and they're not necessarily there to try to ensure the success and vitality of those spaces. You see this a lot in Aspen, where for many years now they've had an open space requirement, and that's where the building moats come in, and different color concretes and the pedestrian malls in certain areas. You wouldn't know that it's actually an outdoor amenity space, except that's what the code required on that piece of land. And so the successful projects there are usually the south-facing corners that have a cafe on them, because that's just a place where people are naturally going to congregate. So one of the things that we were trying to plug in too was what sort of things are going to potentially create a lively outdoor experience from the get-go. And the emphasis that these anchor uses, although they can be changed and modified, we didn't want to see them go away, because the whole point of creating this zone was really to say, from a community serving use, these are things that our community wants and needs, and we don't want them to just be replaced by something like everywhere else, just because someone's not necessarily trying hard enough to get a tenant in there. So, with that, conclude my presentation. Tracy, if you have anything, I mean,
No.
questions, certainly happy to answer those, but it's kind of how we got here.
Yeah, I mean, maybe what I'll do is just kind of highlight some key things. I mean, one, the doc report referred to this big V, so that's preserved in the CSE zoning, and it also had this idea of pedestrian connections. So there are pedestrian connections that are shown for the CDC parcel, and then the P&Z actually wanted another connection through the BCC property that was kind of going from Midland Avenue to the river. So the idea of the vitality uses and some of those ideas from the doc report are kind of carried over with this idea of the anchor use on each of the parcels. The idea that adjacent to Two Rivers Road, everything was this 2.5 stories. So 2.5 stories meant that there's a third story that's permitted, but it's the whole facade of that third story is set back 10 feet from the front of the building. And there's no waiver on that one. The P&Z then also talked that, and the model was done about the first time that 2.5 story on Two Rivers Road was talked about. So it's not only on the CDC property, but also on the BCC property. Then the P&Z really thought that 2.5 story should carry through around the sides of the building, like any time it was adjacent to the park or river, that it also should have that 2.5 story kind of setback. And there is an opportunity for the council to waive that based on certain findings, because if you find out that your building got too big and you lost your pedestrian connections, you might decide that maybe it's okay to have the entire building set back that third story.
So the reason that you say it's a half story, it's truly a full story.
It's a full story.
Setbacks.
Yeah.
But it will be perceived, it won't be perceived as high as a third story, because you're not gonna see it from the street so much. But it is a full story.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that the other concept that will probably get a lot more discussion is this idea that adjacent to Two Rivers Road, adjacent to the river, the buildings are gonna be this 2.5 stories, which was a total of 38 feet high, and then there was some allowance for an underground parking structure. So, this idea that adjacent to the rivers, we're talking about the Frying Pan River and Two Rivers Road and the Roaring Fork River, that we're looking at this 2.5 kind of story idea. The idea that if you were gonna do, everybody's been talking about 4 stories on the BCC property, the idea was that should be in the interior of the property, that shouldn't be up against Two Rivers Road. And that's actually, you can never predict what maybe your biggest discussion item is going to be when you start out in a process. That's gonna be one I think the P&Z is gonna have to potentially work through a little bit more. We did get a letter from I want you guys to walk away with a letter from Chris Galena, and there was one written by Frank Taverna. Frank asked me to read his letter, and I kind of said at a minimum I'd paraphrase it. So he's kind of recognizing the opportunity for the BCC property, and he is,
Need one? Oh, need one of those.
he is,
You can use that.
okay, he's expressing his concern with what I'm talking about, which, our goal definitely here today is not to get in the weeds, but, he just is flagging this, kind of his concern that within the 150 feet of the Frying Pan River, we're only allowing the 2.5 stories. Then, right before I came over here, I got an email from Chris Scalina, and I think I handed that one out to you too. And Chris is the owner. He's representing his family ownership of the Astronaut Hotel, and he's having concerns with the 2.5 stories, and so that is like the third paragraph there. You can read this in your leisure later. He's actually not quite understanding the last comment on the notes on 4 and 5. He's not really understanding what those notes did, which we were kind of setting this buffer, if you could, because we wanted the buildings in the 4-story buildings in the middle of the parcel, we weren't allowing any 4-story, this language as it's written doesn't allow any 4-story buildings to be built right onto Rivers Road. So, don't really want to be totally bogged down with that kind of discussion at this meeting, but, you know, if you want to ask any questions about that, and it's going to be probably one of the bigger discussion areas.
I have a question. Would it be improper in the zoning deal like this to say 2 to 4 stories or something like that? Because if you're looking at the river, you're looking at a different deal than if you're looking at Taverna's location or Crystal's. I mean, it just seems like to say, I'm just unbeknownst, never been on P&Z, just asking.
Well, go ahead. Well, plenty of zoning ordinances do give a range. I think the assumption here has been, since it's valuable property, you're really gonna, the real effective constraint is the upper end. So that was why the discussion was about the 2.5 or the 4. You could put in 2 to 4. The only difference between that here is that would say you can't do a single-story building, and there would be no problem with that. But I think it wasn't I don't think it was a discussion item because the land is too valuable to actually do it that way. It's highly unlikely somebody would do that. So, but there's no reason not to do it. Increasingly, codes do put a minimum in as well as a max.
And honestly, it wouldn't be for a rational reason, it would be for political reasons.
I see.
I mean,
Understand. No, a growing number of codes do that, not because it's political reasons, but because they want to shut the door on somebody really underusing the property, a valuable property that's a key part of downtown.
I mean, we look at this from the standpoint of this is really, it's gonna be a long-lasting legacy, whatever happens here. And given Basalt's history and track record of things, we want to try to get it right as best we can without having necessarily a clear picture of what Basalt wants to be. The river town is an easy concept to say. We have rivers here, we can't get away from it, we're going to be a river town, but what does that actually mean for town? What does town need as a downtown to survive and prosper? And I think Willits has shown us that it's not immune to competition from other developments, and if town wants to be a resident community, then that's one thing, but if we want to have a vibrant downtown, then that's another.
And one other thing I would say is that the language is really written to encourage redevelopment, because you don't get where you want to go if you don't kind of reassemble the properties, like in the Basalt, the BCC property.
And if you don't know about that property, definitely catch up with Tim on that, because I had absolutely no idea what the extents of that property were and the complexities of how all those ownerships work and all of those site-specific features that go along with it. Because you look at it and you say, oh, well, that's easy. Here's this one, here's the other one, and we can just get that and do that, but it's not like that. So, and that's part of where some of our setback things came into play, and trying to set the code up with the number of stories, how they could sort of be situated on the site. Because there are a lot of potential scenarios which don't fit within the model that might be in your head the first time you think about it.
So Susan, did you say, in terms of, you said these letters didn't quite grok the E and F parts, were you saying there's enough flexibility in the code as written? Or?
No, he was, on 4 and 5, Chris, he's correct on how he's characterizing this first part with his concern about the 150 feet. He is understanding now in 4 and 5, that you could actually build a 4-story building adjacent to Two Rivers Road, but it has to be in that first, if you turn around, Chris was interpreting that you can have a 4-story building, but it only can be in this area. The regulations are really written that within this area here, this first 30 feet, that can only be 38 feet high, and that is the 2.5 stories. The 4-story area is this area in here. That's the area where you can have 4 stories. Chris is objecting that the rules currently say also that, and that's his first paragraph, and keep in mind, I got this at 455, but he's objecting to this 150 feet. So within this 150 feet there, you can only have 2.5 stories. And he's excited about the opportunity. I mean, the good news is he's excited about the opportunity for redevelopment or adding to his family hotel base. But the issue is that he owns, these are actually like little envelopes of ownership. That's where the office is. And then there's some rooms back here that's actually like a rectangle. And then again here, this is his building. So this is saying I can't take my existing footprint and put 4 stories, on that property.
So yeah, I mean, I've spent a little time trying to understand the complexity of this parcel, and it's terrifying. So it's not gonna, to your 2 points, it's not gonna play out how you envision it, almost certainly. So I would, obviously you guys are gonna read these letters and see their concerns, but I think there's gonna be need to be wiggle room down the line to say, okay, here's a way we could modify this. But as you described, this is gonna be an overlay suggested code, right?
It's not gonna be a technically overlay, it's gonna be a district in our code, and you say, okay, I'm ready to redevelop, I'm gonna go with a CSC zone district, and you would come in and you say, I want the zoning map to change to this, so we're not gonna do it as an official legal overlay, which has some, connotation.
It's a base zone district that is not being mapped until they ask it to be mapped.
Right.
When it does, then it applies, as we've talked about in here, so. I think one of the things that I shouldn't say this, it's really the P&Z has struggled with, is that you don't want to dream that it can all, hold hands and sing Kumbaya and come together, because it's hard to make that happen.
Mm-hmm.
But if some level of rethinking about the layout of the various partnerships and holdings happens, unless that happens, if it stays unchanged, you can't achieve the vision for downtown. These parcels and little footprint things, you can redevelop them. There's nothing to prevent people from redeveloping, but it would not carry out what you guys wanted to have happen after 2 years of planning, so.
So another question I have is, to what extent, when you went through the process of picking, hey, here's what are appropriate uses, to what extent did the developability of that property come into play? Meaning the financial analysis on that use, compared to the cost of the land and the cost of the development and what the income would be and so forth.
We didn't do a financial analysis of each one. I didn't. I don't know, maybe you guys did. And generally we don't. We did take it into account in terms of when we had some conference calls where we went around in the P&Z and said, so You guys are very familiar with our town and the vision. What do you, I just asked them, what do you think the anchor uses on Lions Park ought to be or could be? And then we had a discussion back and forth where in a number of cases, I kind of said, I don't think that's realistic. That's too small a parcel for that, that parcel is big enough to accommodate more than that. So it was and the reason we didn't do financial is that it just changes all the time. We could do it today in a hot market, but it'll change in a weak market. And so generally, we don't do a financial analysis on each individual parcel. We did more of a size and appropriateness of that parcel for a use of that type. And I don't know if you want to go beyond that.
There was at one point, there was a look, and this was where the 75,000 came into play when the CDC initial proposal of 150 got chopped in half, which looked at some of those numbers and just said, is this a feasible project if you were a developer? And the answer was yes on that. We haven't done anything since then. There hasn't been a feasibility study done on any of this. This list was just a matter of going through and saying, what aspects do we feel are missing? What aspects do we see in other towns that seem to be doing what we're hoping to have happen here? And let's put those in and make a list. And it's, it certainly isn't perfect, but it was a place to start. It's been refined somewhat.
It's gone around 2 or 3 times.
And that was a big reason why we tried to stay away from getting specific with the floor area and too specific with the height, other than to just say, as long as it's kind of like, looks like this in these key areas, then that's what we're trying to get. Let's shape it around that versus missing something amazing because the code says that's the cutoff, that's it, and then going through a whole community process of, well, what does that mean? Can we change that? And those sorts of things. So it's really so general right now just because it kind of needs to be.
Well, and I would point out, since we have the chart on the screen, just and maybe for the viewers or anybody else, the fact that, for example, looking at the Lions Park parcel, we've got Art Center, Sports Youth Center, Town Hall as per. That doesn't mean you have to do all of them. It means you need to do one of them. And as you can see, the first line of B underneath the table, you can't read it all, but it basically says, if Lions Park came in and said, I can't do Art Center and I can't do sports, can't do a town hall, but I can do entertainment. I'm just making this up. You can't do grocery store, it's probably too small, but yeah, if I could do community center, town could say, within the CDs, you've brought it in, it goes to P&Z, they say, we'd recommend that you approve that as an alternative anchor use. And it's something we wanted. We didn't think this was the prime place for it, but it is something that we need in these areas, and we're ready to go ahead. That P&Z could recommend, and you could approve that. But if they came in and said, not only can I not do those 3 dots, I can't do any of the dots on this table, you would say, you're talking a PUD, because that's not something the town can waive unless they amend the CSC zone district. So it's, you can always ask for something that's not in the code,
Right.
but you can't say, I can't do any of this and do it within this zone district.
And there are a number of technical details that we really haven't looked at as far as parking is concerned. I mean, if our wildest dreams come true and, we have a bustling, busy town center, unless we're deliberately saying no to a car, where do they park? We haven't looked at it in those sorts of terms just because, again, we don't really know what it's going to be, and I'd say the standard for what is appropriate has been changing over the last few years with respect to that. And so, there are just other things that need to be considered, but again, that might be something that needs to get considered once there's a specific development application that says this is how we propose handling this, and what is the traffic count going to be, and what's town's capacity at, and
how are they
Those sorts of-
managing the parking?
yeah. So we haven't talked about deliveries or utilities. I mean, little bit, but, those are all things that come in as well. But it's too early.
What about office space? It's not on there. Was that
We talked, the small business incubator was part of the sort of more nonprofit-oriented sort of mechanism that we wanted to at least be able to plug in as a possible use, if it would be possible for the town to, perhaps if Lions Park gets reconfigured, if the Wiley stays kind of where it is and maybe a different, configuration or expands its building or whatever happens, and maybe Town Hall moves over to Merino Park, could we do something above that, which would be a sort of office incubator or what do we call it, the crafts?
Makerspace.
Makerspace. So if someone has a sort of light duty manufacturing thing that they want to get going, to give them an opportunity to do that.
So the office space was a secondary
Right,
use.
it is allowed on
So-
all of them. It's just
So
not-
I see, I
once you have the anchor space, so say you had a hotel or a grocery store, then you could have the office use. So it's kind of saying that office use is a legitimate, important use, but if surface emergence came in, wouldn't be an anchor use, for example, under the way it's currently drafted.
Well, and the secondary uses are actually very broad.
Yeah.
There's a long list of things you could do to help make the economics of it.
Right,
of it
so
work.
for example, free market residential was permitted. It's not permitted on the CDC property, just as a flag. So that's how the secondary uses kind of play out.
And I
They're
think,
mostly, just the normal uses that you would see downtown, except we did kind of broaden we added definitions to the code, so we added this idea of the maker space, and we added the incubator space, and we added a definition of what entertainment meant.
so free market is it allowed as a secondary use?
It's allowed as secondary use, it's not allowed on the CDC property as a secondary use, as it was currently drafted. And that really was coming out of the discussions that were part of the Our Town planning effort, that people didn't want to see free market condos on the CDC property.
and I think too, there's the original idea of the CSC zone in its first iteration, along with Rocky Mountain Institute, and the idea that Basalt could become a hub of nonprofits and just exciting things, incubators and that sort of thing, hasn't been lost, but it's now just a question of how do you best express that, and how does that transform into something which a developer can we could expect to potentially see that come into play. So trying to work those things in here and there. But, are we taking it to the fullest? Probably not. But how could we do that? What could we do differently to enhance that? Because that's gonna be a huge draw for ecotourism and people who are interested in the sustainable movement. That's a big deal, and I don't know how many people realize that. And it's becoming more common, but at least for the time being, there aren't too many net zero buildings around, and Rocky Mountain Institute is a world leader in that sort of area. So we have an opportunity. It'd be great to make the most of it.
Yeah, well, this is great work and a ton of work. It clearly has been the product of enormous thought and blood, sweat, and tears, so thank you very much. I would, I'm curious as to how you, okay, if say on the CDC parcel, you don't have residential, how do you get, I get that you wouldn't build condos there, but how do you finance something how does a developer finance something that we want as a community
Right.
without free market on top or adjacent or something? Was that something you guys thought about? My concern, as you can tell from my line of questioning, is what if you zone it pretty and don't get anything? And maybe that's okay on CDC, but what if that, you know, elsewhere happens, or?
I would just like to clarify that when we say free market, it's free market housing we have talked, so it's a valid question, but other, one of the secondary uses, other commercial office and retail uses allowed in the C2. So the point of the secondary uses is to try to be flexible in terms of saying, okay, I could do what you want me to do if I made enough money doing other things, that I could do an internal cross subsidy. That's actually what you're saying. If it won't pay for its, if the anchor use won't
Right,
pay for
right.
itself, how am I gonna pay for it? Because I'm not paying for it myself. I'm gonna do it with some other money that I've made on this property. And so that's what the secondary use is supposed to be. So I want to be clear when we say free market. There are lots of free market things you can do to charge market rent for.
Right.
The one that you can't do is free market housing, and that, the history is simply the town planning process.
It's been discussed. At one point, we were talking about, could we take this piece of land and do something over there and trade that for this, and, you know, trying to move things around. And I mean, it's not off the table, but it's outside the scope of what we're trying to do with creating this construct of a code. That's more of a higher level negotiation type of thing that would be going on between the town and the developer.
That's a PUD.
I mean, in a sense, yeah.
Well, there are two options. You could tell them, do a PUD, or, I mean, I'm from out of town, I can say this, you know, but, P&Z can think about it again, or town council could give you direction that you want it modified to do that. Again, I'm not trying to throw a wrench into the works. The point is to get this to the point where P&Z feels good about it and the town council feels good that it is offering enough opportunities and is close enough to the vision that it's actually gonna work, so. But that's exactly right. If it went forward the way it is now, you'd say you need to do a PUD or some other zoning that allows free market housing.
And we've specifically tried to avoid specifically designing this code for one particular project. Because if you don't get it, then you've just blown all of that.
It almost never
effort.
works. It almost never works.
So, again, that's where we get to this, let's create this sort of invisible envelope around these spaces and try to shape those pieces the way that we want to kind of have it integrate into the town fabric, and then sort of let the developer come and say, this is how I'm gonna fill that envelope, and here's how I plan on doing it, and here's what I need to do it, and that's when the town has to say, all right, well, we can make that work, or we can't, and we're gonna have to think about something else.
I would point out there is a, you know, from my perspective, just as looking at all the different codes I've written, there's a lot of flexibility in this for P&Z and town council. We talked a little bit about the ability to move anchor uses around. Susan talked a little bit about the ability to waive the third floor setback if you make certain findings. There are 2 or 3 places in here where, you know, I think P&Z was faced with the question, but what if I could do most of it, but I couldn't do that? There are 2 or 3 things in there. And I guess there's also in the uses specific language saying if you want to limit a use, yeah, that's okay. You've asked me to switch a different anchor use, or you're filling it up with a secondary use. We're okay with that, but with some limitations, or with that's in here too, to kind of say if you're okay generally with this, but they're asking for too much of it, or they're asking to operate it in such a way that it's going to be hurtful to the downtown. So I guess those are just examples where, what I don't want to have happen is people avoiding this because there's not enough flexibility to kind of work it out. So there, and this is, it's an interesting process, even though it's only a 2-step process rather than a 3-step process. P&Z has the opportunity on the preliminary to do that kind of fudging around to see if they can make it fit and recommend it to you. You've got that opportunity, and then it goes around again, and you got that opportunity the second time, really, so.
Cool.
Katie, do you have any questions?
Just to clarify, I haven't fully
Yeah.
gone through this packet, but this particular zone is the 14 pages that's contained in here?
Yes, that's right.
Okay.
Right.
So that's obviously, like Auden was saying, a lot of significant time and thought has been placed into this. So thank you for that. And then also, I guess, just reiterating what we're discussing is that a developer currently has almost infinite options. I mean, if they wanted to go on CDC, they could, right now, put a trailer park on it. They could go with CSC if and when we adopt it, or they can go down the PUD route and just dream up whatever they want.
Right.
So there's really no limitations, just suggestions.
Right now, this is a suggestion, and we're trying to hopefully make it
More so.
workable, at least, so that it's not completely excluding a realistic development scenario, because it has to pencil out in some way, shape, or form, unless the town wants to heavily subsidize or develop, which I think I've seen towns do a really bad job of that usually when they try.
You know, what we usually see, like particularly on the CDC property, is someone comes in and they don't really want to put themselves through like the experience of submitting an application and really having it ripped up publicly. So the fact that if you can tell someone more clearly what's gonna be acceptable, you know, you're inviting you're more inviting an application that can give you what you want, rather than, yeah, I know I can do the PUD, but, you know, there's risk to do that. And, you know, we've all seen the public process. We all saw, you know, what happened with the low application that, you know, wasn't even an application yet. But most people don't want to spend that kind of money, you know, in a repetitive process.
Right.
They might do it one time and then,
Well, the idea is that unlike a PD, if you offer an attractive alternative, and I don't know if they'll come to the party, as we got a lot of people thinking about what's doable and what's close enough to the vision, so, but we don't really know. The thing about PDs is, if you get a use that goes out, they write a PD, and I call them shrink wrap PDs, because they're usually, the more you think about it, the more you put it around it, even despite your best intentions, since it's an individual negotiation, you're gonna make it pretty exactly what you want. And when the tenant goes out, when the ownership changes, when something happens with Colorado law that this is no longer an attractive thing to do, you're having to rewrite that your PD, you're having to amend the PD, because the point of, the idea here is that A, it sends a message to the markets, but B, should those things happen in the future, okay, they built it, and now markets have gone south or sideways, and somebody new is owning the property, or the economics of hotels changed completely, that you wouldn't have to amend this. There would be the flexibility within this to come in and replace that use, or to replace that building without having to renegotiate the individual terms of a PD. And again, in theory, you could write a PD that wasn't subject to that, but in smaller communities, when it's the result of a really detailed, long planning process, that's kind of what happens, is that it turns out to be a really, you know, it's a tailor-made suit, and then it only fits one guy.
So your sense is that you put this in place, it's good guidance for for people coming in, they have other options per your point, but get it in place so the town puts forward this vision of what it wants in the future. What are the barriers to moving forward and getting this zoned in this way? What are the next steps?
I mean, if we wanted to actually apply it to the land, you mean?
No, I mean, just do whatever you want, it doesn't have to apply, not change codes, but just get it done.
I don't know that I understand.
Well, I think if the town council wanted to adopt this as a language amendment, it still wouldn't apply to the lands. The step that would have to take, I mean, we envision it would be a property owner coming in and say, I want it. And I don't think there are barriers behind that, other than if we've been realistic, somebody putting a package together and getting the financing and getting the pre-leasing to make it happen. Maybe I'm misunderstanding your question.
Well, doesn't the town council have to adopt this and say, yeah?
Yes, yeah.
So what we did originally, and I
Yeah.
didn't kind of explain this, but one of the resolutions adopted this schedule. So that resolution 9 kind of said, okay, we're gonna adopt this schedule, and this meeting was an actual public hearing on the CSC zone district, and then we were gonna give it to the town council, and the town council was gonna hold a public hearing in the end of May and the beginning of June on adopting it. And I think even though we haven't heard really that much from the council, our thought was we're moving too fast, that that we need to really spend some time getting the council educated and make sure that we're still marching along the direction that the council wants the P and Z to take action on. So instead of going to public hearing, so that's what was gonna happen. We were gonna have a public hearing. We only need one public hearing to adopt it. Town council actually needs 2 readings of the ordinance to adopt it. That's all that's really needed from here on, except practically, we wanted to somehow get back in front of the council and say, are we good? Because we don't really want the P and Z to spend a lot of time really working through this if this isn't what the town council wants.
Right. And do we, I don't know formal procedure, do we ask for public comment at this meeting from our public here?
No, this is intended to be a work session, so it's just a conversation that we can have without addressing those aspects of things. But once we get into our first and second meetings regarding the official adoption of the language, that will certainly be public comments at that point.
Got it, okay.
Your process of adoption would also mirror that. So yeah, as Susan said, it's really just, we wanted to introduce or perhaps explain a little bit in more detail what we've been doing, how we've been coming at this, because I think that's probably been one of the more difficult things from what I've seen. If you're not at the meeting the whole time and you're just reading the papers or catching news, however, is that there's probably a lot of misinformation that was being used because of the politics of the election, and that's understandable, but at the same time, we want to make sure that you guys have a good understanding of where we're coming from with this. So if you have suggestions, I mean, there's nothing written in stone at this point, and we're trying to do the best that we can, I think, to accomplish what I think everyone in town wants to have happen. It's just a matter of how exactly do you do that, and that's a really tough question to answer right now. But at least this could be a framework where someone could come in and not get burned at the stake if they propose something that fits within and around these guidelines. Because town is a scary place right now out there. I mean, it's
Not so scary.
talk to the people trying to do something here, or considering it. I mean, it's a tough neighborhood right now, but I don't think people are that far apart. That's part of it, though, that I think is unfortunate. Is there's been a lot of fighting over stuff that's really not
Misunderstood.
all that. Nobody's really arguing about the basics. So,
Well, thanks again.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for the time. It's always-
No, thank
Very
you.
helpful.
Yeah, super helpful.
Great. Can take a break now, or?
Yep,
All right.
okay.
all right.
Okay, you guys, Alex, we